of deceit and murder.
Will the killer be brought to justice?
I have got an unidentified body.
It was unbelievable.
Did she say what it was?
No, that she knew who to call. And then she thanked me and rang off.
And there was nothing more?
I know there was something else, but I can't think.
Well, if it does come to you, you can give us a ring.
Yes, of course.
Morning, sir. Don't you get a cooked breakfast at home, sir?
No, Troy, I do not.
I got that medical report.
I must find the doctor.
The lethal remains were actually in extremely good condition.
The skeleton itself was very slender for a male. There had been no movement in those bones after death. There is potentially on the head that the skeleton had suffered from quite a number of traumas. Small, very shallow wounds on the skull, which appear to be consistent with a sharp blade, and those had taken off small parts of the skull bone. The one to the top of the head had an appearance that was perhaps consistent with something along the lines of a dagger being hit into the head with some force. None of these injuries would have been fatal. Area of the right cheek, where there was a small rectangular perforation in the bone. There was a cut mark on the mandible, on the jawbone, on one of the right ribs, and again it was a cut mark. And then there was an injury on the pelvis, so that's the area of the hip bones. And what's actually happened there is that a sharp blade has come through the pelvis from the back to the front. Large injury, it's clearly been inflicted with a sharp blade, it's taken off a large area of the skull. And this is probably something that would have caused death. It might not have been absolutely instant, but it would have caused him to die.
Not treating this as murder, are you, Inspector?
We're not ruling anything out.
You seriously then, sir?
No, Troy. Actually, I'm just filling in time till tea.
Barnaby on a case, is he?
Yes. Link the skeleton that we've dug up with a known living descendant to trace a direct relationship. If we can find a female direct relation who had a female child, who's had a female child, and so on down to the present day, then we can find somebody who should have the same mitochondrial DNA as, hopefully the same mitochondrial DNA as our skeleton.
Mitochondrial DNA. It's passed down just through the female line.
The killing field.
Richard III, the man responsible for the murder of the two boy princes. He also got rid of another member of his family, the Duke of Clarence, who mysteriously was drowned in a vat of Malmesbury wine here in the Tower. Also responsible for having his own private secretary, William Lord Hastings, executed here in the Tower. A villain.
At its most extreme, he's presented as some kind of cross between a pantomime villain and a deranged serial killer creeping round the Tower, bumping off various friends and relatives. It's fair to say that Richard was not the perfect king, and he probably wasn't the perfect man either, and he is associated with some dastardly deeds. However, it's very fair to say he's no better nor worse than any other king of his period. He's just self-interested.
Richard III is a much more complex and fascinating character. For Shakespeare, the motivation was simple. Richard was a cripple.
And we have to remember who he was writing for. Queen Elizabeth I, the granddaughter of Henry VII, the man who finally overthrew and killed Richard.
The hump has been painted in. This one here, the originally normal back, was raised only a matter of half an inch or so at some subsequent date, probably very soon after it was painted, and another link of the chain of his collar was added very badly to suggest that he was unequal. And it's just enough because this shoulder is very sloping down that way, and it does make an unevenness. And the X-ray that's been made of this, which showed that the shoulder has been raised, also showed that the eyes were not originally so narrow and the mouth not originally quite so tight. This one hasn't been doctored. The Tudors never got at this one. It was in the country, in Norfolk, and picked up in the 18th century, and that's how it got here.
There was a traitor in the family, but it wasn't Richard. It was his big brother George, Duke of Clarence.
I think his most characteristic feature before 1483 is his loyalty to his brother, Edward IV.
8 years after the failed coup of 1470, Clarence was again found guilty of treason, and this time Edward was in no mood to show any mercy. He allowed Clarence to choose his method of execution.
England had found stability at last, and Richard had shown not the slightest sign of wanting the throne for himself.
History may have done Richard III an injustice. He wasn't a hunchback, he didn't betray his brother. At the moment, he certainly doesn't look like the kind of man who would murder his nephews.
Once you start investigating it, you find he's really a rather nice person. A desire to right a wrong that's done to somebody.
The North had been very disturbed since at least the mid-1450s. I think Richard does bring a degree of stability and peace to the North that he hadn't seen for years.
He uses his counsel as a means of arbitration in disputes. That's not new. Lots of other nobles did it, but he did it very effectively. And he continued that as king. He seems to have developed a particular dislike for the bad administrator.
These don't seem to be the actions of a morally bankrupt man. The records show that he endowed universities, gave generously to the church, and paid for masses to be said for the souls of fallen comrades. A pious man who read complex works of theology. None of the evidence so far about Richard's motivation fits with him being the prime suspect. He was a model brother to the king, and as far as his nephews were concerned, a model uncle.
The king caught a chill after going boating. Within a few days, he was dead. Everything changed.
King Edward IV died unexpectedly. He was just 40. The crown passed automatically to his eldest son, who became King Edward V. He was only 12 years old. His brother, just 9, had the same name as his uncle Richard. Because immediately he threw off his role as loyal lieutenant and moved centre stage. Edward's son, the uncrowned Edward V, was travelling from Wales to London for his coronation, and Richard immediately rushed south to intercept him at Northampton.
And I think people are really scared anyway when you get a minor inheriting the throne, because that obviously opens up the possibility for political intrigue and factionalism.
He burst into Rivers' bedchamber and arrested him. He and other senior advisors to the king were immediately hauled off to Richard's castle at Pontefract in northern England. He raced to the village of Stony Stratford. The king was told that Rivers had been arrested because he and the rest of the Queen's family were plotting to assassinate Richard. Richard told the king he would now be travelling down to London under his protection. Richard suggested that Edward stay at the Tower. No one thought there was anything wrong with that. It was, after all, where kings traditionally stayed prior to their coronation. So Edward moved in sometime in mid-May, and his younger brother followed shortly afterwards.
He'd already been accepted as the chief counsellor, so the government of the kingdom was going to be conducted under his leadership. And this was quite normal and as expected. However, it wasn't normal in minorities for the protector, as Richard III made himself in the end, to both have the responsibility of the government kingdom and have the custody of the person of the king.
The one man who would certainly resist any attempt by Richard of Gloucester to take the throne is William Lord Hastings. So if you're going to go for the throne, in Richard of Gloucester's position, if you're going to go for the throne, William Lord Hastings is certainly a man that you're going to have to take out.
He started by pulling the same trick he'd used on Rivers at Northampton. He lulled them into a false sense of security. He was relaxed, friendly. He left the meeting for a while. When he returned, Richard's mood had changed. The Queen was plotting against him. Then he rounded on Lord Hastings, accusing him of being in league with his enemies, before he was dragged off. A few minutes later, he was dead, beheaded on a makeshift block on Tower Green.
Richard III probably was making a political judgment about his best interest, calculating that if he didn't make himself king, in the long run he'd become a victim, in particular a fear that he had about the influence of the Queen's family around the young king, Edward V, and the possibility that he couldn't hold on to power.
Paul's Cathedral. And here, on June the 22nd, an extraordinary statement was made. It was meant to be a sermon, but the crowds knew the bishop reading it was Richard's mouthpiece, and he was announcing Richard's own claim to the crown. What stunned everyone were the grounds he used to justify it, a series of quite scandalous revelations about Richard's own family. Edward, Richard's brother, had been born out of wedlock, and so had the two princes. This left only one legitimate heir to the throne. 3 days after declaring himself king, Richard executed Earl Rivers and the other men he had arrested at Northampton. July the 6th, 1483, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned King Richard III of England at Westminster. The princes were taken right into the bowels of the White Tower, and almost as soon as Richard had been crowned, rumours began circulating that they'd been got rid of. The princes disappeared, but in law that doesn't prove a crime's been committed. There's been a whole host of pet theories and alternative suspects. First up, the Duke of Buckingham. He was a slippery careerist who helped Richard's bid for the throne. In the tense months following the coronation, there was a major rebellion against Richard. Buckingham, perhaps feeling the tide was turning, threw in his lot with the rebels. They started by aiming to free Edward V from the Tower, but halfway through switched to supporting a minor Welsh noble, Henry Tudor. Tudor would eventually become Henry VII. With the two boys locked securely in the Tower, only the king has access to them. But which king? Richard was only on the throne for 2 years before Henry VII took over. Suppose Henry, at his moment of triumph, had ridden into London and found the two boys still alive in the Tower. There's little doubt that Henry would have killed them if he'd found the princes alive.
If they weren't dead, or if she didn't think they were dead, why did their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, support a rebellion, apparently, to put Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, on the throne?
The theory is that she had the princess killed as part of a scheme for her own son to emerge as the principal rival to Richard. This second rebellion of Henry's was the last round of the Wars of the Roses, and Henry led it for one simple reason. He was the only claimant to the throne the House of Lancaster had left.
He's the grandson of an illegitimate son of John of Gaunt, who's the third son of Edward III. So he has no claim to the throne at all.
And the army he brought to England comprised mainly of French mercenaries. This was a foreign invasion, not a popular uprising. Richard was waiting for him. The battle that took place here August the 22nd, 1485, seems to divide English history in two. Shakespeare makes it seem as though Richard had lost the battle before he started, but actually it wasn't anything like that. On the morning of the 22nd, you'd have put your money on King Richard. Henry Tudor, the Welsh pretender, was a rank outsider. The king had got the advantage of the high ground, and he'd got an army about twice as big as Henry's.
Lord Stanley was a man who'd always managed to be on the winning side, and gradually became a very powerful and influential person, used to his own advantage.
The battle started at the bottom of the hill when the two vanguards engaged. It would have been brutal and bloody. Then suddenly Richard noticed that Henry and a few of his followers had become detached from the main body of the army. What if he could kill Henry? He could finish the battle and save his kingdom at one blow. He couldn't resist it. Down the hill and straight at Henry. The two forces clashed at a place called Sandyford. Richard killed Henry's standard bearer. He killed a second man, and by this time he was probably just yards away from Henry. But at that moment, Richard's horse was killed from under him. Lord Stanley at last committed himself on Henry's side. Get a horse, my kingdom for a horse. One of his men offered him a horse so he could make his escape, but he refused and went down fighting. Body was stripped naked, slung over a horse, and then paraded through the streets of Leicester, the last medieval king of England. They buried him in a nearby monastery. Later, when Henry Tudor's son, Henry VIII, dissolved the monasteries, his bones were dug up and thrown away. The coffin ended up as a horse trough.
A really black picture of the Wars of the Roses as a warning as to what can happen when you have dynastic strife. And since Richard III is the last of the Wars of the Roses kings, and the one whom Henry VII turfs off the throne anyway, he comes in for particularly powerful denigration.
Far from being the monster of popular legend, a chance discovery in a French archive turned all of this on its head. A new discovery was made, one which provided an extraordinary answer. Rouen in Normandy. Brother Edward, who was the father of the two princes, was illegitimate and shouldn't have been crowned king at all. When England was still at war with France, Richard's father, the Duke of York, was serving with the English garrison. Rouen was the English HQ in France, and he had his whole family with him. Richard's eldest brother, later King Edward IV, was born here in 1442. And the key thing to understand is that Edward only became king because the Duke of York was of royal blood.
Drew a register for the summer of 1441. It tells us the clergymen are being paid for a sermon to be delivered for the safety of the Duke of York going to Pontoise on campaign. He wasn't there at the crucial time. He's not with his wife.
So, even though Edward IV was conceived here, his dad wasn't here?
That's right.
It had to be somebody else?
It would.
But we know that Edward's birth date of April the 28th means he must have been conceived around the first week of August. The Duke of York was fighting in Pontoise from July the 14th to August the 21st, but the register provides further evidence. When the second son, who was to die young, was born a year later, the register records a massive celebration for him.
No expense is spared. The whole cathedral is thrown open, the relics, the choirs singing, the most precious objects are put on the altar. Edward's christening is hushed up. It's in a tiny private chapel in the castle. It's so extraordinary to celebrate the second son with so much more honour than the first.
The records here back up gossip from the time, because when Richard made his extraordinary claim at St Paul's Cross that Edward was illegitimate, it didn't come out of the blue.
All Edward's life, people were whispering behind his back that he was a bastard. What made them so sure was that he looked nothing like his father, unlike his brother Richard, who was the spitting image of their dad.
Richard and his father were small. Edward was a 6'4" giant. And Edward's own mother is reported as twice saying he was illegitimate. The rumour at the time was that he was an English archer called Blayborn. Burly, handsome, a bit of rough.
Edward IV, rather than being descended from the noble house of York, was in fact the child of a presumably very tall archer from the garrison at Rouen. And if Richard was aware of this, then suddenly we see him in a very different light. If he was the legitimate king, then what does that make the two little boys in the tower?
With Edward dead, it was his duty as the only surviving brother to restore the honour of the House of York.
But I think it was a matter of necessity rather than evil, grasping ambition, because they attracted the faction that wanted to unseat the rightful claim and put the rivals on the throne.
The legitimate line died out. It was the archer's DNA through Edward which entered the royal blood. Edward had a daughter, and she became the bride of Henry Tudor, who wanted what he thought was good royal blood to boost his own claim to the throne. The rogue genes were firmly lodged in the royal line.
It means that some of the most famous characters in history, like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, shouldn't be there at all. Every single member of the royal line since has been tainted by the blood of the Archer of Rouen. The monarch's claim to the throne is based simply on being descended from the right person. But if Edward IV corrupted that line, then who should really be wearing the crown today?